My guest is Elana Sofko. We talk about what happens when traditional media meets new disruptive technologies. It's the Kick and Snare podcast. Let's count it off. Welcome to Kick and Snare. My guest today is Elana Sofko, founder and principal of EBSAF. I'm going to let you guess at what the AF stands for unless Elana wants to tell us.
Good morning.
Good morning. EBSAF is a consulting and advisory practice focused on transformational media. Welcome.
That's correct. Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. You were on my list of people to talk to for a while. And then I said, I have to get around and do this. So that's why I suggested we spend this time together. So as you know, I want to get into some of your professional history because it's cool. It's interesting. It's different.
It was a job.
I'm glad it was at least that, but it was more than that. I think you've done some very cool things, but let's first touch on what you're doing these days. Tell us about the current role and what you're doing, and then we'll jump into your sordid past.
I've started a consulting and advisory practice. I've logged a number of years sitting in transformational situations where a technological innovation triggered a change in consumer behavior, which impacted the way people consume media, the way companies produce and distribute and monetize media. My whole career has been at that inflection point. And so I've gathered a lot of experience in managing that kind of change across all different kinds of media, whether that's, radio, digital, mobile, streaming video. And so I thought it would be helpful to provide services on a fractional basis to help steer companies to not just suffer from disruption, but to leverage and optimize the disruption for growth purposes within a media company.
Understood. Yeah, your career history is certainly not only interesting, but it shows that repeatedly you've been at that sort of inflection point of disruptive technology affecting traditional businesses. It's been interesting in that way. And as I've spent some time similarly over my career, we've bumped into each other also.
We certainly have, yeah.
So it's kind of cool to have been, on a different version of that same sort of trajectory with you. So I'm psyched that you're doing this. This is cool stuff. Let's get into that history. So your early career was in radio, and when I say radio, I guess it's what we now call terrestrial radio. Nobody was calling it then. It was over the air, ad supported radio, if I have that right. And that's a business that at the time, and probably still is, complex. It doesn't always operate the same way, but generally it's supported by advertising, and then there are syndicated radio shows that are also supported by advertising, I guess, ultimately. But I'd love for you to tell us how you got into radio. What did you do? Was any of it especially innovative at the time? And, because I know you had a cool transition to something really disruptive for radio, but I'd love to know the old days. You told me about cutting tape at one time. So I'd love to know how you got there and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I started my career as an audio engineer. I was mostly live audio reinforcement for live events. I started doing that kind of work as a stagehand when I was in high school for the city of New York. There was a New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, Queens Council on the Arts. And I spent time as a stagehand at municipal venues in New York City that would have these sort of summer concerts. And so I'd be there setting up chairs and mic stands and music stands for the Queens Symphony Orchestra or Chamber Music Concert Series or Richie Havens. That was my first touring gig with New York City. And that led to other kinds of audio reinforcement gigs where I was just super fascinated by the technology and it was from a physics standpoint, and the fact that it could come out into something you could hear and change what you were hearing.
Sure.
From a science perspective was fascinating to me, but also at that time I was learning what an amazing charge I used to get out of a live event. whether you're working it or in the audience, a ticket holder. And to this day, I still feel that, excitement. So I learned about audio reinforcement, but I didn't know about recording. And I sort of did this reinforcement all through like high school, college, and got some goofy corporate type low level jobs after college that just didn't make sense to me. And nights and weekends for pocket money, I was, running the boards for friends of mine in a local band at some bar,
Right.
things like that. And eventually I was led towards a company that used to be called Point of Purchase Radio, pop radio. So it wasn't classic terrestrial radio, but it was a background music service that was provided to grocery stores, toy stores, and drugstores that was ad supported. In the very much the same way radio is regular radio is ad supported. In that case, because we were not using FM or AM airwaves, I got to learn firsthand about satellite communications, C-band, again, appealing to that sort of physics science geek in me. And at the time, right, this is sort of late 80s, you started seeing some communications businesses, media businesses who had been using C-band for lots of different things start to transition to KU band, how that's different, what you can do and not do. Plus, there was other technologies that were involved in distributing a signal like that. For example, the ads were delivered on cassette tapes to a machine that was half cassette player, half satellite receiver. And there were Q tones that would trigger each other. So you'd hear music and it would fade down. You'd hear an ad after a Q tone triggered it to start. It would play until the next Q tone, and then it would stop, and then the music would fade back up. So I actually did that kind of work for like 8 years. What was fascinating to me about it, apart from what I've already described, it was also during a time where recording technology, which I was starting to learn as analog, and that's where I learned to cut tape, was transitioning to digital. So we were transitioning not just how we recorded and produced a 30-second spot, but we needed to be able to network it together because we were batch producing lots of programming. I mean, we had our programming in 18,000 stores. It was a fairly aggressive operation that was run on a shoestring budget. So Pro Tools didn't exist then, and we were not a Mac shop. And so finding software that all the editors could use where we can make a production line, if you will, available so that we can produce for the store was super interesting. And at the same time, I was talking about earlier about the satellite delivery of it. That was also going from analog to digital. It used to be we'd rent a phone line, an 8K line to deliver content to our head end, sometimes to go out on satellite for certain occasions. Well, that started transitioning to ISDN lines.
Sure.
And that was its own excitement or not, depending on how you looked at it.
Sure.
But there were all kinds of technological challenges, and I just really enjoyed all of that. Now, doing that work for 8 years, making the radio show in the grocery store got a little old to me as a 20-something. And at that time, I started thinking it would be interesting to go and get a master's degree. Started realizing that I can do all of the audio engineering that most people can do, but I'm not like genius at it. There are other people who are really, really talented engineers. I'm definitely not one of them. So I enrolled in a part-time MBA program out of the University of Connecticut because I lived nearby, and started going for an MBA because I'm actually really good at the business stuff. And I was starting to get a feeling for that at the point, and I wanted to sort of fill in the gaps of my knowledge base because I was completely self-taught about business at that time. Never took a business class before that.
So at this point, the technology is changing. Your interests are also changing.
Yes.
And so we decide to go to school and do something different and get away from cutting tape and worrying about the delivery. Tell us how that happened, what drove you there, and go from there.
I started realizing I was just better at business, and I was starting to take classes for it. And I took this one finance class. and they were going to teach us how to track stocks. And we were given this assignment: go find a company you want to track, and we'll just do this exercise. While I was looking, there were a couple of companies that I found that were really interesting. One of them was called CD Radio. They'd gone public not long before that. They were pre-operational, and that put a challenge into the finance class of how do you get a stock price when you have no revenue? But there was a stock price. So it was an interesting challenge for the professor. And I just dug very deep into that business. I had occasion while working, Pop Radio had been acquired by a number of companies. By the time I was in business school, it was a division of News Corporation, and they were trying to launch Fox News Channel, which was an interesting time to be there for. I can say that while I had an opportunity to be looking for an alternate music source for the Pop Radio product, I found an excuse to reach out to the people at CD Radio and introduce myself.
Good
and
for
I
you.
sat down and I talked with them and asked them if they would be interested at all, or, operational in time for, the ability to become a music source for this, radio show in the grocery store. And the answer was, well, we're still building the business. And the more we talked, I left that first meeting by saying, there isn't a way you can launch this without me. I'm one of the only people in the country who knows exactly how to exploit, addressable receivers with subscription multi-channel audio and monetize it both by subscription and by ads.
That makes sense. It was interesting that you had the insight, and brilliant that you shared it and sold with it. I think that's very cool.
It felt so bold. And I walked out of that meeting thinking I had shot myself in the foot by being too aggressive. The answer I had gotten from the person I was meeting with, who eventually offered me a job, was he was bowled over, didn't see that coming. He really did think the reason for the meeting was the reason I was there. And it is the reason I was there.
Sure.
And it was a spontaneous remark on my part, but I felt it with my every fiber of my being.
Right.
I wanted to be the first customer of this service because they were going to offer commercial-free music of all different genres, and nobody was playing what I liked on the radio. So I believed in what they were doing as a consumer. And I think that's part of what prompted that kind of remark. And so he said, well, we're so pre-operational, we're not really hiring, but, we know who you are if we ever decide to start hiring. And so again, I walked out thinking, well, maybe that was my brass ring and maybe I blew it. And within 90 days, they offered me more money than I asked for.
That's fantastic.
And I joined the company in the late 90s.
Right. So
now CD Radio is now Sirius XM.
Yes.
Were you about to ask about the...
It's good that you're bringing that up. I think for people who have been listening along, they may not have made that connection yet, and that's important for them to have in terms of context. So I knew that, but I don't know that everybody listening will, and they may not understand that Sirius Satellite eventually became merged with a competitor and otherwise. But so that's where you get the XM from. But I guess what I was going to ask is, like, that was a bold move for sure, as you put it, or as they put it, and opportunity knocked and you sort of kicked the door open, and that's cool. And I can relate to how that might have felt risky, but what did you take away from that, and how did that inform the rest of the things you did in your career in terms of risk taking and seeking opportunities? And, would you advise people to do that kind of thing? I guess I'm curious about it from that perspective.
I have to say that in my experience, it hasn't always worked when I have presumed there was an opportunity I was well suited for, but it never hurt me to try.
Right.
And so I would say, always try, always have the conversation. The worst that can happen is that they'll say, not now, or no. And that's not a bad thing, actually.
Right. Yeah, sometimes no, at least you say when I was in sales, sometimes you don't begin to really start selling until the customer or the prospect says no. And, and either you learn from it or they learn from it, and, something happens as a result.
Yep.
So in the beginning, Sirius started out as a and maybe this was the vision at first, was a subscription only revenue model, as I understood it. Was it always a vision that they would have advertising as part of the equation? Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, it was always on the table.
Okay.
The idea was, and the market research we had, which was, 20 something years later, highly reliable in retrospect, always showed that there was a market, a fairly large market for subscription-based radio, that the number one driver at that time that people would subscribe was commercial-free music, because you really couldn't get it anywhere unless you curated it yourself.
Right.
And so we knew that commercial-free music was very important. We also knew that non-music programming has a better tolerance for interruption, because you don't have to stop tapping your foot like you would in an ad-supported music station. And sometimes you need a minute to digest what you just heard on a talk show or a piece of news.
Right.
We knew that the audience size coming in for commercial-free music, we believed about 30% of it would drift over to the non-music channels, because that's what was happening in terrestrial radio anyway.
Sure.
And it sort of set the table for, why wouldn't you just ad support it? Because you won't have nearly the ad load. I mean, at the time, Howard Stern had a 22-minute ad load on his show on terrestrial radio. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And he'd run them all at once. I mean, what advertiser is going to want to be in the middle of that?
Right.
So we had a compelling proposition for a smaller audience, for advertisers, but who were self-selected and pre-qualified, and sorted out into psychographic groups based on where they landed on the non-music channels.
Right. So here you're disrupting traditional media business in a big way, and it didn't kill terrestrial radio, but it certainly changed a lot in the industry. Ultimately, you left there. You went to A&E, which, if people don't know, stands for Arts and Entertainment. Although by looking at their if you look at their programming today, you might think it's the Reality Channel or the Duck Dynasty. It's the Dynasty Channel. I don't know.
People forget that the M in MTV stood for music.
Yeah, that's
and
also
so
true.
It's similar with the A&E. Did used to stand for Arts and Entertainment, but that was starting to change when I joined the company.
Right. So tell us about that transition. How did you get there, and what was attractive about it? Because from my perspective, at least, and this may be ignorant, but I'll risk it, it seemed sort of less interesting on its face than Sirius. So tell us about that.
So leaving Sirius is part of that, right? So I left Sirius a year after service launch. So I was with that company for 5 years. 4 years pre-operational. It was very fulfilling to see it come to market, to deliver satellite radio's first dollar entirely, which was ad revenue, not subscription revenue. After a year, what else are you going to do? Like, you've done all these precedent-setting, groundbreaking things, right? There were legal precedents that we set and all sorts of, so we defined new licensed rights. Satellite radio rights just didn't exist before satellite radio existed. So what do you follow that with? Well, so the folks at A&E had approached me and said, we are not really sure about what direction our company is going to be headed in with respect to our core business, or with respect to all of the things you can do around our core business. And they were starting to shift their core business, the History Channel and the A&E channel, and even the Biography channel eventually became the FYI channel. And that was sort of, while I was there. And they thought, well, what else can we do? What else can we do with these assets, was sort of the question I was asked.
Got it.
And so I joined the company and created completely new revenue streams for them in what you would now call digital media. And we did it under license. We did it without threatening or cannibalizing core business, without triggering favored nations clauses in, MVPD distribution agreements, things like that. And so A&E's digital media business was created in an era before digital media was called digital media, and we were profitable right out of the gate. We didn't have to invest, develop something, and then wait for the revenues to come in. We were striking where there were already pockets of resource.
Got it.
So that to me was interesting. It felt like a startup within a well-funded, stable environment
Sure.
that way.
With good content and otherwise, yeah.
And a good company to work for that had a history and a reputation of that.
Right. So you worked across multiple platforms, right? And we met at that point in the context of developing a mobile platform, maybe not the only one, but a mobile platform, I should say, for the network. Mobile at that point was sort of a new thing. At least mobile content was a new thing. So it was a pre-smartphone before mobile computing really had begun to jump off. And so you were innovating with this within, I think, a somewhat traditional environment.
Yes.
What was it like? Was there resistance to these things? Like, who's going to watch TV on a phone? Like, did you get that type of stuff?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
A million times over. And in part because I did the first cable deal with Moby TV, which was like the first, maybe the only, unicast linear streaming.
I remember.
And this was in the feature phone days, right? So I did the first cable deal without triggering favored nation clauses with Comcast or any of the other distributors. And yes, I got all kinds of resistance. It felt a little bipolar at times, right? So you'd get the who's going to watch TV on a phone, the way I got in satellite radio, who's going to pay for radio while radio's free, right? You always get those skeptics, and they're important to listen to sometimes.
Yeah.
And the rest was, if I was doing something that looked like it was turning out well, then there would be a turf war around it and why it shouldn't be happening from the part of the business I was sitting in and really should be a part of another area in the business. And so it was back and forth of a game of hot potato on one side and a game of give me that on the other. And so
I've seen that kind of thing happen.
Yeah.
You developed this little thing for us. That's cute. And then as soon as it becomes meaningful, somebody wants to take ownership of it.
Well, we need to be strategic about it now.
Right. Well said. Well said.
Yeah. So it was hard to do that way. It's hard to manage that kind of corporate behavior and still deliver, and like to stay focused on your mission when you don't have executive sponsorship lining up behind you exactly the way you need it to do it well.
Right. Well, that theme, I'm sure, continues and will continue to exist for a while within companies, certainly. The bigger they are, the more likely for that to happen, at least in my experience. And I imagine it's similar for you. Was there resistance at times driven by who was pushing for it? And you come in from the outside, you don't have a traditional TV background or cable background or those types of things. Here you are in this network. You're talking about new technologies that people don't understand yet. And some of them are so nascent that nobody knows what's going to happen with them yet. Certainly Moby TV is a good example of it was before the networks were fast enough, before the devices were capable enough, but it was the right idea, of course. Mm-hmm. Were they resistant also because you're a woman? Was that part of it?
I have had whiffs of that, not so much at A&E. A&E was pretty well balanced. There were other places where, if it came out of my mouth, it was dismissed. But if the same verbiage came out of the guy sitting next to me at the conference room table, it was a great idea.
Right.
I have experienced that many times.
Yeah.
But yeah, A&E wasn't... That wasn't my biggest issue.
Right, that's good.
At A&E.
Well, I also, maybe it's worth a shout out to some people we know in common, but I remember working with other very capable, fearless, innovative women at A&E. And so that speaks well of that place, especially at that time. So is it okay? Can we shout out Beth Harrison? I mean...
Oh my goodness. If anyone has crashed through and pioneered new ideas successfully, it is Beth.
There you go. There you go. She deserves a shout out. We'll have to point her at our conversation later. So after being in this traditional environment, you went to the technology side. So you essentially, went to Nokia to develop a content business. So let me rephrase that. At first, you were developing new technology and innovation within traditional contexts. Then you went to a fairly innovative technology context to
fill it
with content and introduce them to the content side of the business, which I think is very cool. And some technology companies have gotten the content businesses right and flourished. Others have struggled. I won't shout out the big guys who everybody knows. tell us about that experience and what it was like to work within that environment, global environment, technology company, trying to get smart about content, realizing maybe they were a little late. I don't know. I don't want to presuppose all this stuff, but I'm curious as to your thoughts.
There, admittedly, a little bit of shell shock, and my professional network thought it was surprising that I'd go and work for a consumer electronics manufacturing company. But what I saw of what they were doing in the world of mobile content was impressive to me. So, and I worked out of the Nokia US headquarters. This is, and when I joined, people would say to me, "Oh, that little Japanese startup that never really caught on." They would always say this. And the truth is, outside of the US, Nokia, a Finnish company, was dominating market share in every country but the US and Japan.
Indeed.
Everyone had a Nokia phone. And most people in the US, when mobile phones started to proliferate here, almost all of our first phones was a Nokia.
Sure.
A 6250, in fact. And then they kind of lost their footing in the US. And that's why my network would say to me, "Oh, that little Japanese startup that almost went away."
Right. Nokia. If you say it Nokia, it sounds Japanese. If you say Nokia, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
So, but what I was seeing, because I was looking very closely at media, where media and mobile were, intersected, as you were at the time, I could see that this company was hell-bent on disintermediating the telcos in the US so that they could provision content directly to the phones without the middleware taking a cut.
Right.
And I thought anyone with the guts to do that is a place I want to work.
That was bold at the time, because this is before Apple was doing it, right? I think still at this point. Yeah.
I joined the company 6 months before the iPhone was released. And they put me in a business development role, and they said, connect us with entertainment and entertainment companies in the industry that are thinking about wanting to, but give us the good brands, get us the good content, and we will find a way to make a seamless connection through a feature phone for a consumer to be able to consume their content. So for most of that 6 months, I, dutifully knocked on the doors at NBCU and all kinds of places, Paramount and ESPN and what have you, looking for content relationships for the company.
Right.
And then the iPhone came out.
And the world changed.
Yes. And so for a few months, Nokia was sort of skeptical that Apple could make a dent in their market share worldwide, and certainly wouldn't hinder their ability to get better relationships with carriers in the US for their devices to be sold. But they were wrong. And right around then, there was this massive company reorg. They had organized around the idea that, hardware, the phones, worldwide were approaching 100% penetration. Almost everyone who wanted a cell phone had a cell phone.
Yeah.
So they knew that new phone sales after around that time would really be a matter of replacements.
Yeah.
And that is not a growth business for them. So they had started this software and services business to capitalize on the install base, like participate in the downstream revenue from those kinds of business activities, which, we all believed was the right thing to do. And it was. But there was this massive reorg after that, keeping this focus on software and services. And I was told, hey, you've done some programming with content in your past. We need someone to look over the global content strategy of a mobile app store. We hear that Apple is going to come out with an app store soon, and we'd like to be a fast follower. And here's how our app store will be different than their app store, and just go figure this out and figure out how to figure it out. So again, it was like very much startup conditions in a well-funded environment. So similar to A&E from that perspective.
Right. But some undeniable market pressure at that point too, right? I mean, the sense of urgency must have been huge.
And it was global.
Right.
And that was the other piece of it, which I didn't have as much experience. I had at A&E, I had plenty of experience working as an American company with sort of international outposts in different countries, working on digital media opportunities for the company. But this is working for a global entity that's not just an American company with international outposts is different. And so I had country managers. There were, couple of hundred countries, and some of them are grouped a little bit, but there were, a couple of hundred country managers that I had to make sure had the right guidance and information sets so that they can make selections on a local basis of what apps they should be choosing for ad campaigns and putting on the home screen and devices that were being shipped to their areas for retail sale and all of that. And so it was, working in a huge matrixed organization where there wasn't like a command and control management style. That was very different.
Interesting.
And then adapting, my work to different cultural aptitudes and tastes. I mean, for example, the App Store in the Middle East had a lot more and different restrictions on the content that could come through it, for
Right.
example, than in the US. And so we had to know all that.
My understanding also is that, and I think it was probably still true by this point, the economics of mobile phones was different in different territories. So some
Very.
markets were postpaid, particularly like in the US, where you get your bill at the end of the month and you pay. And so the economics are a little different than in other markets where which were prepaid. And in some cases, the hardware, the phones themselves, the handsets were not part of the service that people were buying necessarily. So it created some flexibility in terms of some of the business models, as I understood it. So that must have been a fairly interesting thing to add to the sort of global fragmentation, if you will. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's totally true. In most countries, and I only assume it's still true, you buy a plan from your telco and you buy a device from Carphone Warehouse or some other place where you buy consumer electronics and you put your SIM card in and you're off to the races. In the US and Japan, usually you buy your phone from the telco with the service. So, and they are a bit more in different gatekeeping practices around that. But also every country has its own content regulations too.
Right. And then I guess the mobile, what we would have called cellular infrastructure, is different and subsidized in some countries, not in others, and so that changes some of the relationships between the telcos and what sort of grants they got in terms of being able to be restrictive and monopolistic and things like that. So it's a fascinating business.
But I went to ESPN after after Nokia for
Tell
like
us
a
more
year and a
about that.
half. So after Nokia, I went to ESPN. I was tapped to lead an internally focused technology think tank, reporting to the CTO, who's now retired, on how to predict, envision, and prepare for delivering an interactive sports viewing experience for a future consumer. And that was pretty interesting concept. And what I found when I got there was that pretty much everyone was focused on getting through the week and the month, and nobody really was motivated to think that far into the future. And so the executive sponsorship for what I was asked to do vanished, or maybe it was never really there. And I spent about a year and a half there with what is inarguably should have been the coolest job on the planet.
Right. You're kind of the innovation queen, right? I mean, that was sort of the role. Yeah.
Yes, and that's why they liked me for the role. But it was just very uninspired. And, after meetings, we'd have great meetings and lots of great ideas. And then people would take me aside after the meetings. It's awesome. And I love your meetings, but, that's work and I'm busy. And this was a company that wasn't motivated to innovate. And so I very quickly started looking around. I felt terrible taking their paycheck. There wasn't enough for me to do.
Right.
So I started looking around and found myself interviewing at WWE.
Got it. So tell us about the experience there. It involved global expansion and probably some insights, I imagine, in terms of where wrestling would and wouldn't be successful.
Yep.
Which I've heard some surprising data about that in the past. So I'm curious if you'd speak to that.
Yeah, sure. People move around a lot, like skilled people move around a lot within the companies. So the 4 years that I was there, I did a variety of different things, including launch their SVOD in the US, the channel that's now on Peacock.
Got it.
but a lot of my time there, to your point, was helping the company's international expansion. We were opening offices in different countries and setting up a way to do business there that capitalized on the tour of the show,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is highly monetizable both as a live event and for all kinds of sort of downstream opportunities from that as well. So I was opening up, we had set up a series of websites that were keyed off of the American English one in the US. And
Mm-hmm.
we would push out assets, articles, photos, videos, other kinds of artifacts to the countries, and they would take the content and they were empowered to do whatever they think they needed to do to attract and make it locally relevant.
Right.
So they didn't have to use any of it if they didn't want to. None of the articles, texts, photos, videos, images, GIFs, anything we were sending down, they could use whatever they wanted. They could rewrite everything, just translate. It didn't matter so long as they were creating something that was reflective of what was happening on Raw, SmackDown, and all the pay-per-views.
Got it.
And was more relevant for them. So you have wrestlers who are, nationals of other countries, for example. Cesaro is from Austria, and he speaks several languages fluently, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So they would feature him more in, German forward countries
Right.
than others because he was just more culturally relevant. We had business development people and editors on site in language, and we even did an Arabic site out of our Dubai audience, which was super fascinating to me because the character set is different.
Mm-hmm.
And it reads from right to left, and it made some interesting design thought processes. It forced it to happen. Do you put the search box over here or over here if
Sure.
everything is and there were translation issues that were really fun to puzzle out. We used to do that as a group. I would have the global calls. We would rotate who has to talk in the middle of their night, and everyone took a turn having a meeting in the middle of the night. We did that at Nokia too. I stole the idea. But we would, so, wrestling, pro wrestling has its own language, kayfabe.
Mm-hmm.
If you're familiar, kayfabe has a vocabulary. It's not huge vocabulary, but it is made up of American colloquialisms.
Right.
And I'll give you an example. There is a finisher. Finisher is like a winning move a wrestler would do.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of wrestlers are known for their finishers. They give them names. And so one of them is human wrecking ball.
Right.
And so we'd sit down with, the guy in Tokyo and the person in Mexico City and the person in Sao Paulo and one in Munich who was also handling, ironically enough, the Germany office handled the Polish and the French websites as well.
Yes.
Ironic. And we would sit down and talk about, how do you translate human wrecking ball? Is it like literal human wrecking ball, or is there another way of talking about a wrecking ball and personifying it? So we would have to have these conversations.
Yeah, that's cool stuff.
About translating kayfabe internationally.
Got it. That's interesting. So tell us about how and when you got to Chicken Soup for the Soul Entertainment, and a little bit about what you did there. And then I have some, I think, specific questions about some of the things you did while you were in the role of Chief Strategy Officer.
Absolutely. WWE it empowers their people to do what they think they need to do to deliver for its owner.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, it was very liberating and fun to be told to take risks or to service a risk that we were asked to be taken.
Right.
But it's a hard company to work for. And so after 4 years, I started thinking maybe it's time to look for my next adventure. And an old boss of mine from A&E had been working at Chicken Soup for the Soul. He was trying to start an entertainment business. They were doing it by producing branded episodic content for cable networks. Thinking of how many revenue streams are attached to something like that, it seemed like a profitable way to get out of the gate. And so he called me one day and said, I need someone to take care of the digital things. Are you interested? And I thought, well, I talk to everybody, as I said at the beginning of our talk. Always have the conversation.
Sure.
So I showed up and he says to me, you need to meet the CEO. And I sat down with the CEO, and we had a great conversation. And before long, I realized that he was the founder and CEO of, I had mentioned earlier when I'd gone to business school and I was tracking stocks and found CD radio that became Sirius.
Mm-hmm.
The other company was called WinStar Communications that I tracked.
Oh, right.
So the guy that I was talking to, who is the CEO of Chicken Soup for the Soul, had been the founder and CEO of WinStar.
How
and
funny.
I thought, oh, what are the odds? And so I let him know that I knew a lot about his company. I'd actually tried to work with them when I landed at Sirius. I had actually tried to get a job there too. That one didn't work. And so very quickly we got into what would you do if you were to come here? And I kind of said what my piece. And it took a while. They weren't quite ready to start staffing the organization. So it took some months. And at some point, I got an offer to join, which I did. By the time I started, the person who referred me had left the company, and I effectively replaced that function.
I see.
Within a year, we'd gone public. It was a microcap IPO. It was a Reg A+. It was a Jobs Act function. But we were able now to access, the markets for, working capital and other things. And I was the chief operating officer from about then. That would have been August of 17. Mm-hmm. I'd been there almost a year at that point. And I stayed the chief operating officer until sometime in May of 21. And I was responsible for the normal things that the COO would be in charge of, but I also ran mergers and acquisitions, strategic planning, and other things. It was a broad remit. But as a lot of times in startups, you'll wear more hats than you probably should until you can start hiring to fill gaps.
Sure.
And I'm a good gap filler, as it seems. And so we bought 9 companies over a 6 or 7 year period.
Wow.
That put together a vertically integrated entertainment studio model. Born out of the disruption of the television and cable industry because of direct-to-consumer streaming, another technological innovation that enables video provisioners to go straight to consumer. And a lot of legacy media companies were sort of unfairly suffering from that change in consumer behavior for many reasons. They couldn't or didn't evolve as fast as they needed to. And so what we found were there were plenty of otherwise undervalued but distressed assets that we could come in, stitch together, lower the cost of revenue of operating by making them work together when it made sense to, letting them operate independently when it made sense to. So we had at the later stage of the company, probably about 8 different operating units that had some dependencies on each other and could operate independently as well.
Got it. That's an interesting project. Wow.
Yeah. I had never bought a company before. I now have done it several times. I can now say I've spent a decade in mergers and acquisitions, which I never would have guessed would have happened in my life.
Right. Yeah. It's funny when I finally got involved with the company that was acquiring others, I was reminded of the fact that I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is to line up a good deal and, do due diligence and buy a company. But the integration piece is often harder, than the buying piece.
Yes.
And I think a lot of purchases end up not fulfilling their potential because people don't think deeply enough about the integration process. It's not just products and services, it's people and culture and those types of things that can often trip up that process. But you did it 9 times. That's amazing.
Yeah. So the last couple, while I was chief strategy officer and not in an operative role, because there wasn't anyone whose job it was to keep a keen eye on ensuring that you're reaching the synergies you told the investors were important to this deal, I would sit and worry. There's duplicate cost here and nobody seems to know or care, and that worried me a little bit. Because I was effectively the first employee of the company, I felt and I believed so intensely in what we were doing, the way we were doing it. It was hard to not have feelings as an individual contributor about what was and wasn't happening and what could be a problem for the company going forward, knowing what I knew about how hard it was to make the integrations happen, to your point.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So we touched on, and we don't need to go long on this because you have had a very successful career, despite the disadvantage of being a woman in a often male-dominated environment. I have to imagine, and I think I know without even having you say it, that sometimes you've been the only woman in the room, either figuratively or literally. I think that many people, particularly women, of course, know what this is like. My question for you about this is, how can men or women be better allies in this situation? How can we do better so that it's easier for women when they are the only women in the room? And how do we leave the door open for more women to come in?
I love that you have asked that question, because it is difficult as a woman to point out something that may not be a deliberate circumstance that results in, lack of allyship. It's often inadvertent or accidental.
Sure. It's circumstantial. And yeah.
So for women to continue to say, yeah, but you end up with a reputation about having a soapbox, and people sort of think that's you're a single issue person after that,
or you're loud.
So yeah. Right. So apart from some obvious things like making sure you're not only asking the women to take notes in a meeting or do the PowerPoint or organize the lunch or the victory party afterwards, right? Because that's happened to me too. And you know what? I'm terrible at making PowerPoints. And so I would just, okay, I'll do it. And I make the stick figure versions of PowerPoints. And
I can do that, by the way, if people need that,
But some of the more key things is speaking, if you see something, to say it, something you think a woman probably would say, and say it for her. So I'll give you a great example of that. I was talking to a bunch of investment bankers at a fairly large, prominent firm on Zoom, right? So there's like 20 of them, and there was me and my boss, who's male. And we're chatting away, and my boss finally said, and we're talking about an engagement, whether or not we'd hire them for something. My boss says to them, do you have any women at all over there? Because I've never seen a woman at your company. Do you have and they'd say yes. Not in an admin role, I mean.
Right. That's awesome.
That was huge. That was huge for me, because I was not in a position to do anything other than listen to what they had to say and decide whether or not they were the right firm to represent our interests.
Yeah. I'm going to make some guesses about how that went. How that came out. That's good. And I'm interested in this topic in general. I've been in business for a long time, and while I like to think that I've operated well, I'm sure I've made a lot of the mistakes, either by virtue of circumstance or ignorance or just being too focused on what I needed in any given situation. So I think I like asking that question, because I think a lot of us, especially those who have old habits, if you will, that die hard, it's good to be reminded of ways that you can, if you're well-intentioned, of course, ways that you can make things better. Another question for you. So you've clearly worked with some people who are inspirational. Tell me about a person who is inspirational to you, either personally or professionally. And, if they imparted some wisdom or key advice at a pivotal moment, that kind of thing. I'm curious if you'd be willing to share something like that.
I'm going to start with Denise Oliver. She's known in the radio circles, network radio circles. She is mostly known for her work producing the Howard Stern show in the earlier days when he was in Baltimore. She handpicked Robin Quivers to work with him. And in the Private Parts movie, if you recall, that Howard Stern's book that became a movie, they actually have someone playing her in the movie, which I thought was awesome.
That's cool.
Now, she happens to be one of the first women who broke through the glass ceiling in the radio industry. And so there really weren't women in senior level positions in network radio. And in fairness, radio in the up to the, say, mid 80s was like a little mom and pop business because of FCC regulations. And so you didn't see a lot of big companies in radio until sort of mid 90s. I want to say early 90s, mid 90s. Anyway, she was one of the first women I'm aware of that crashed through that glass ceiling and was an SVP of programming at Westwood One. Now I got to meet her, and I knew all about her. I knew about her career and who she worked with. She also produced Rush Limbaugh and the Grease Man, if you know who he is. She was
Mm-hmm.
skilled at the shock jock shows.
Right.
Knowing her is ironic because she's very gentle and nice and calm and broad-minded about all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But when I finally got to meet her, we became instant friends. And there was a time in my career where I felt like I should have been rising up into the right career-wise. I should have been progressing, getting more senior roles. And I just was frustrated that at that moment it wasn't happening. And she said to me, it isn't realistic to think your career is going to always go up and to the right. Plateaus are actually normal. They happen to everybody. You shouldn't let that stop you, but you shouldn't be beating yourself up and thinking that, that some failure on your part, because everyone goes through that. And
Right.
don't worry about it so much. So there's a combination of how she mentored me, and we're still in touch to this day, and also the kind of achievements she's made.
That's
Similarly,
great.
there's Madeline Berger, who is known as the godmother of digital at ESPN. She left well before I started, and I got to meet her in the days of, you'll remember this, Moby TV.
Mm-hmm.
Qualcomm also had a video play that used UHF channel 55 called MediaFlow. And she was doing content licensing at MediaFlow, and that's how I met her. And she was doing those swimming upstream, Sisyphean feeling kinds of activities most of her career as the only woman in the room. And she's just sort of didn't let it stop her ever. And she just continued to knock one after another out of the park. She and I had many mutual friends, and we initially met around Qualcomm wanting A&E content. And we also got to know each other very well. And she would also say things to me about how to manage my career and sort of be the only woman in the room without losing for it and things like
Right.
that. So
Right.
between those two, I thought I was well taken care of.
That's good. So jumping off of that, now that you are well experienced and successful, what sort of advice or wisdom would you pass on to, I was going to say people, but let's say women who are either embarking on careers or interested in media, entertainment, or any other category? What sort of wisdom would you pass on to women who are maybe sitting where you were at one time? Or where you were sitting at one time is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I don't know that this would only ever apply to women, but I would
That's okay.
say in particular they should listen in. When I went to college, I have a degree to teach high school English in secondary schools. I wasn't sure what my career would bring, and I didn't know what to go to school for. And so I like to read, and that's an education minor sort of got me a place where I could be employable somehow if I needed it. And the rest of it, I treated my journey as the destination, and just sort of looked for job opportunities that would inspire me, challenge me, that were just interesting to me. And it almost didn't matter what they were. I characterized my career path very early on as not having one, and just sort of avoiding things I don't like to do in favor of things I do like to do.
Got it.
I talk to a lot of college kids frequently about this, because a lot of them, there are a lot of kids who know what they want to be when they grow up. And
They're
I
very
think that's
directed.
great.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kids who don't, and I was one of them.
Oh, me too.
And there isn't anything wrong with that. It's not an excuse to be lazy about it. You do need to pay attention and be aggressive about understanding the kinds of activities you do enjoy versus the ones that you don't. But sort of staying true and authentic to yourself and continuing to do things that I had done, like try and avoid the things you don't like in favor of the things you do, led to quite an interesting career for me that I didn't ever expect to land in.
Understood. Mine has been similar, actually. It resonates with me a lot because I typically followed opportunities when they came along, but the curiosity was played a role in this. And I like learning new things and, jumping into new categories. And when people have asked me a similar question, like, how did you plan this path, or, what path did you choose? Like, first of all, it's a circuitous route at best. But it evolved, it happened, and not without some direction at certain points, of course, but it wasn't like there was some sort of linear up and to the right, as you put it, plan in mind to make it happen. And I think when the people who are very directed want to be able to follow that, I think it's probably a larger group of people who don't necessarily have that vision, especially when they're young, and don't necessarily feel that it's okay to just, follow their muse, if you will, and to try new things and experiment and accept some failures and understand that they're part of the learning process and moving forward. So what you say resonates with me a lot. So final thoughts. This is a very, very serious topic. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yes. Let's go serious face for this. I gave it away. It's not that serious. What are you listening to lately?
Oh, wow. Trombone Shorty.
Cool. Okay. All right. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good answer. Another question I like to ask people, and this will be interesting, especially given your professional history. What was your first concert?
Oh, no, this is kind of funny. The first concert, my first concert was Hall & Oates at Madison Square Garden with Steel Pulse opening.
Oh, love Steel Pulse. I mean, I like Hall & Oates too, but I absolutely love Steel Pulse.
Yeah, it was a neat show. I was in 10th grade. We were told by parents, because we went as a group, it was a few friends, we could take the subway there on our own because we grew up in Queens.
Right.
And one of the parents came and picked us up afterwards. Now, ironically, I live near Daryl Hall's club now. And I go there fairly frequently because I still get that chill for a live event. And
Sure.
I'm a sucker for it. It almost doesn't matter what it is. Even the WWE live events were just as thrilling to me as my favorite concerts have been. Now, I've never seen Daryl Hall at his club, but I've seen a lot of really good acts at that place. It's nice to have a place like that near home.
What was your last concert?
I got to see the Smithereens again at Richfield Playhouse in November. And that was so much fun. They had Graham Mabey playing bass. He was Joe Jackson's bass player.
Right.
I believe it was Robin Wilson fronting them. Pat Denizio, their lead singer, had passed.
Yeah.
And Robin does a great job with them too. So it's so much fun to see them. There's such talented musicians, and they played all the hits and all kinds of, I don't know, it was fun. They riled up the crowd. I mean, we're all a little older now, but as
are they.
Yes. I know.
Well, that's cool. Thank you for sharing that. And it seems like we're into March. You're overdue to go see some live music. You must be jonesing for that. So we'll look forward to hearing about what you're going to see next.
I actually have tickets. They're not until the fall, but I bought them because I have an RV trip planned for this fall to see Alison Krauss in Union Station featuring Jerry Douglas. It's some venue in New Hampshire that I've never been to.
Fantastic.
And that's sort of on the journey on our planned trip. And so I'm really looking forward to that. I've seen Jerry Douglas at Daryl's place, very close to him too. And that's just so amazing to see him play like that. And he's just such a talent. Anyway, so cool. I'm excited for that. I'm sure there'll be concerts in between, but that's my next ticket.
Sounds good. So with that, I guess we will close. For anybody who's curious, you can find Elana on LinkedIn. And if you can't do that, don't bother calling. No, I'm kidding. Well, certainly don't call. Nobody does that these days. But if you want to get in touch with Elana, by all means, reach out to me, make a comment on the podcast if you can, whatever, because she is out there and consulting and sharing her wisdom with media companies going through transformational processes. Let's put it that way. So thank you very much for joining me. I love the conversation. This was great. And I'm honored that you were able and willing to be here. So thank you so much.
It was a treat. Thank you.
Okay, good. Talk to you soon.